70 years ago, one man's ambition would lead the Soviet Union to the brink of glory. But somewhere along the way, ambition turned to obsession. Glory turned to disaster, death, and disgrace. This is the Soviets' obsession with beating NASA. The Soviet Union space program began in pretty much the exact same way as the Americans, by stealing intellectual property from the Nazis. In the aftermath of World War II, there was one prize that stood out above all others: the Nazi rocket, the V-2. Technically, this was a long-range ballistic missile, the first ever created, and a devastatingly effective weapon that had killed thousands of people in Europe and reached out as far as England. But the difference between a ballistic missile and a rocket is negligible. So much so that the V-2 actually became the first man-made object to reach space, climbing to an altitude of 175 kilometers in June 1944. It was the Americans who came away from Germany with the real prize: Wernher von Braun, the man who had invented and engineered the V-2. But the Soviets were able to get their hands on several completed V-2 rockets, along with von Braun's blueprints for future designs that were never realized. It's also claimed that the Soviets acquired a few Nazi rocket scientists of their own. For the decade that followed, both the Soviets and Americans would leverage the V-2 technology to build out a truly horrifying arsenal of nuclear weapons. This included the Soviet R-7, a behemoth of a missile, 5 rocket engines, 5 fuel tanks, 20 nozzles, and an upper stage that could carry a very heavy payload to a very high altitude. The intended purpose of the R-7 was to reduce American cities to flaming rubble. But it didn't take long for the Soviet leadership to get creative and find a more practical, less apocalyptic application for the missile's incredible power. Nikita Khrushchev was the instigator of the space race. He was the leader of the Soviet Union from the mid-1950s to the mid-60s. He was the successor to Joseph Stalin, but Khrushchev was a much different leader than Stalin. He was an outward thinker. He had a significant investment in how the world perceived the Soviet Union and communism as a whole. He was obsessed with propaganda, and Khrushchev quickly recognized the potential of spaceflight as the ultimate propaganda machine, a new way to make the entire world stop and recognize the Soviet Union not for their violence or destructive capabilities, but for their technological superiority. In particular, he wanted to demonstrate superiority over the United States of America. For the Soviet Union, this would become more than a competition, more than politics, more than propaganda. The space race and beating the Americans would become an obsession. And Khrushchev was right in his basic theory. The Americans had nothing anywhere near as capable as the R-7. American rocket technology in the mid-50s could have barely put a grapefruit into space if the rocket managed to get off the pad without exploding in the first place. The Soviet R-7 rocket was made possible by a brilliant engineer named Sergei Korolev, a man who was handpicked by the Soviet leadership to lead the first ever human spaceflight program. The vast wealth of the empire was put at his disposal, whatever it would take to beat the Americans into space and prove Soviet technological superiority, and the order came down from Khrushchev himself: put a satellite into orbit at any cost, regardless of risk or danger. Now, the good news for Korolev was that he'd already done the hard part. The rocket was built. Now he just needed a satellite to launch. Sputnik 1 was essentially just a radio stuck inside a metal ball with 4 antennas sticking out. It couldn't do much other than transmit its own location, but that's all that was really needed. As long as the Soviets could prove to the world that their object was in space and orbiting the Earth, then they would win the race. The first leg of the race, that is, and there would be many more to come. On October 4th, 1957, the first Sputnik successfully achieved orbit around the Earth at an altitude reaching as high as 939 kilometers. Now, instead of being looked at as a major accomplishment for humankind, the launch of Sputnik 1 only served to heighten divisions between communist and democratic nations. President Dwight Eisenhower takes to the airwaves to address the American people and calm their anxiety about the potential threat of this new Soviet technology. Behind closed doors, the US government is just as anxious as the people. they need to demonstrate to the world that they can compete with the Soviets. They need to catch up, and they need to do it fast. Now, here's where things start to get weird. Khrushchev sees firsthand that he was correct in his theory that outer space could be used as a theater to demonstrate Soviet accomplishments and promote communism on a global scale. Time magazine goes as far as naming Nikita Khrushchev Man of the Year for 1957, and it's all because of Sputnik. But now he has to up the ante. He just started a race that has no clearly defined finish line except maybe the moon. Either way, the Soviets are in the lead and they need to maintain that position. Korolev was again summoned and given a new order. This time, put a man into space. This must be done at any cost, and again, regardless of the danger. Though, in one of the rare moments of caution in the story of Soviet spaceflight, they made the decision to first send an animal into space before launching a human being, largely because no one knew if it was even possible to survive a trip to outer space and orbit the Earth inside a capsule. So Khrushchev demanded a spectacular space mission for the 7th of November 1957, the 40th anniversary of the October Revolution that had birthed the Soviet Union. The team had just 4 weeks from launching the first satellite in human history to figure out how to take things even further, and failure to meet the deadline was not an option. It was decided that Phase 2 of the space program would launch a dog into space. They chose a stray from the streets of Moscow, a mutt with no specific breed. They named her Laika, which sounds like a very nice name to the English ear, but in Russian it literally translates to barker. Korolev knew how to get an object into orbit, but given the tight timeline of aligning with the anniversary celebration, he could not figure out a reliable way to get that object back down, at least not without waiting for it to literally fall down. So it was well known from the start that Laika, the space dog, would not be coming home. But the circumstances of her death didn't need to be as terrible as what ended up happening. This is a sad story, but it is important to begin illustrating the obsession with the space race, with beating the Americans. The Soviets were more than willing to disregard safety and humanity in pursuit of their goal. Laika was strapped into a cockpit with a harness that would hold her down so she didn't float away. There was an automated system that dispensed food and water, enough to keep the dog alive for 7 days. The plan was that the final serving of food would be laced with a poison that would humanely euthanize her. Now, for their part, Korolev's team was able to pull it off. In just 4 weeks, they designed and built the Sputnik 2, with all of the systems necessary to keep their passenger alive for the flight duration. This was a rush job though, and everyone knew it. The team would draw up a new design on paper and then immediately begin construction. There was no time to test anything beforehand. But they met Khrushchev's deadline, and the rocket was launched on November 3rd. And days later, the Soviet Union celebrated their revolution with the first animal to ever orbit the Earth high above them. Of course, the people weren't informed that Laika was already dead by November 7th. She survived about 4 orbits around the Earth before Sputnik 2's temperature control system failed, and she overheated. So, not only did the animal suffer unnecessarily, the Soviets didn't even learn anything particularly useful from the experiment. She didn't live long enough to gather the data that they were looking for. The Soviets also missed an important lesson about the value of taking time to make sure their spacecraft were safe, because this was not the last time that safety would take a backseat to deadlines, and there would be many more tragic consequences along the way. Even in these early days, a pretty distinct separation was beginning to form between the Soviet method and the American approach to spaceflight. Now, the Americans were definitely no strangers to animal abuse of their own. They killed a lot of monkeys, but the overall pace of the USA was slower. The rockets were smaller. They didn't fly as high, and to their credit, the Americans were trying to recover their monkey pilots alive. They just couldn't quite get the technology right, but they kept moving forward, one small step at a time. Meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, Korolev is racing towards the first manned spaceflight. With one highly unsuccessful dog mission under their belt, the Soviets begin to recruit a team of top-tier jet fighter pilots to become the first cosmonauts. The men were sworn to secrecy. No one knew who they were or what they were doing. Even their families had to be kept in the dark. In August 1960, the Soviets tried again with another animal mission and managed to send 2 dogs to orbit inside Sputnik 5. They spent 1 day in space and then returned safely along with a gray rabbit, 42 mice, 2 rats, flies, and several plants. They became the first Earth-born creatures to reach orbit and return alive. Unfortunately, not everyone involved in the Soviet space program and rocket development was so lucky. Due to the level of secrecy involved, it's hard to know for sure how many people were killed and injured in the race to human spaceflight. We do know about the Netherlands catastrophe, which occurred at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in October 1960. A prototype of the R-16 rocket was being prepped for its first test flight when a short circuit caused the second stage engine to ignite on the pad, which detonated the first stage booster like a gigantic chemical bomb. It's reported that the explosion killed 54 people, although we didn't even find out that this happened until 1989, so it's hard to say anything for certain, but it is known that the rocket was being rushed forward to meet another November 7th Revolution Day celebration, and yet again, safety fell by the wayside in favor of schedule. By 1961, Korolev and his team had put everything that they learned from their Sputnik-based animal testing into a new spacecraft, the Vostok. It wasn't much, but the Soviets believed it could get a man to orbit and back. Well, mostly. The thing that Korolev couldn't figure out yet was how to land the new capsule without killing the person on board. The return velocity was coming in just a bit too high for the parachutes to handle, and knowing this, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was chosen to be the first man to ride the spacecraft into orbit. Now, of course, we all know that Yuri survived the flight on April 12, 1961, but what many people still don't know is that in order to avoid being pulverized inside the capsule, Yuri was ejected from the Vostok at an altitude of 7 kilometers. That's just below cruising altitude of a commercial airliner. He parachuted all the way down in his spacesuit. It took 10 minutes to reach the ground. Yet again, the world was buzzing with news of the great Soviet triumph in the field of space exploration, and the communists maintained their technological superiority over the capitalist Americans. President John F. Kennedy sent congratulations to the Soviet Union for their outstanding technical achievement, while also telling the people of America that it would be some time before the US could match the Soviet launch vehicle technology, and that the news will be worse before it's better. For the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, this was another vindication. The glorious destiny of the Soviet Union was clearly in outer space. This only fueled the obsession. He wanted more. His new set of goals would range from great ambition to pure insanity. The first man on the moon must be Soviet. Then they would build military bases on the lunar surface. Then cosmonauts would paint the entire moon red so that the world would never forget that they lived every day under Soviet dominance. Now, to their credit, the Soviets were not entirely wrong to get cocky at this point in the space race. While the Americans had technically put their own man, Alan Shepard, into space just 1 month after Yuri's flight, the NASA missions were only suborbital. The capsule would go up and then fall straight back down again. NASA spent an entire year focused on these low-altitude flight tests. Meanwhile, the Soviets were having men spend an entire day in outer space. Of course, the moon was still the ultimate goal, the real space race, but even working within the Soviets' loose definition of safety, getting to the moon was unfathomably difficult. It would require incredible power, far more than the R-7 could deliver, so Korolev set to work on his masterpiece, the N-1. This was a monster, 17 meters in diameter at the base, 30 engines, at 105 meters in height. The rocket tapered down to an upper stage that would carry a Soviet crew capsule and a lunar lander with a crew of 3 men on board. But the monster would take time to build, so in order to maintain their propaganda machine, the Soviets would need another trick to show the world: the first spacewalk. Alexei Leonov is given the honor of becoming the first man to exit his spacecraft and float freely among the stars in March 1965. He also comes dangerously close to becoming the first dead body to float freely in space. For yet another example of the Soviets failing to properly test their system, or just straight up sending hardware that's not even finished being developed yet, they hadn't done anything to account for the effect of the vacuum on the spacesuit. The The suit needs to be pressurized in order to keep the person inside alive. When the pressurized suit is in a similarly pressurized environment, everything is fine, there's balance. But when the cosmonaut steps out into the emptiness of space, the balance is gone. The pressure inside the suit pushes out with nothing to contain it. Alexei leaves his capsule and instantly begins to blow up like a balloon. His suit expands so much that he can hardly move. He can't even press the shutter of the camera mounted to his chest. He manages to pull himself back to the hatch of his capsule, but finds that he's now too large to fit through the airlock. Now, to his credit, Leonov did not panic. He persevered. He opened a valve in his suit to begin slowly venting oxygen. This depressurized him just enough that he was able to fight his way back into the airlock. It's said Leonov's body temperature rose by 35 degrees Celsius during the ordeal, pushing him to the edge of heat stroke. He remembers his spacesuit sloshing with sweat that floated around him as he struggled. So Leonov made it back into the capsule, but he still almost died again on the way home. When the airlock was separated prior to re-entry, the force sent the entire spacecraft into a spin. Then the craft's automatic re-entry system failed, so Leonov and his crewmate had to manually straighten out and deorbit their own vehicle. This set them wildly off course. They ended up coming down for a landing in the middle of a Siberian forest, about 400 kilometers away from the intended landing zone. The two men spent the winter night in their dead capsule surrounded by wolves and bears. Luckily, they were rescued the next day. Many years later, once all of the Soviet information was declassified, Leonov would say, "I keep going over the mission and I keep finding mistakes that could have been avoided. They could have led to tragedy. Everything was on the edge." And that pretty much sums up the Soviet space program to this point. So many mistakes are made, so many obvious safety issues are ignored and left up to chance. Almost no plan is ever thought out all the way to the end. At most, they get the first half finished and then just launch and hope for the best. Frankly, it's some kind of a miracle that Lake of the Dog was the only one to die horribly on a space mission so far, but the Soviet luck was about to run out. In 1964, Khrushchev was removed from office, overthrown in a non-violent political coup. He had grown old and sick, where once his comrades saw ambition and power, now they sensed weakness. In 1966, Sergei Korolev died suddenly. He left a lifetime of work unfinished, including the N-1 moon rocket, the LK lunar lander, and the Soyuz spacecraft. Now, if you thought Korolev played it fast and loose with safety, things got even worse after he died and his work was carried on by people much less talented. Soyuz was supposed to be the next major step forward for the Soviets, an evolution of the R-7 rocket booster with a much larger and more capable crewed spacecraft on top, one that could take men to the moon. But early Soyuz development was plagued with failures. Regardless, the Soviets had an ambitious plan for the debut of their new rocket. They would launch 2 uncrewed Soyuz spacecraft in rapid succession, then they would perform an automated docking maneuver in orbit before separating and returning to the Earth. The first Soyuz launched without issue on November 28, 1966. The second Soyuz exploded on the launch pad the following day, which was fine because the orbital docking wouldn't have worked anyway, because as Soyuz 2 was bursting into flames, the control system on Soyuz 1 was failing. It ended up spinning helplessly through space and burning up all of its thruster fuel until eventually falling back down into the atmosphere over China. The Soviets triggered a self-destruct, and the spacecraft exploded in mid-air. The third uncrewed launch attempt of Soyuz also blew up on the launch pad. And with this trifecta of failure under their belts, the Soviets moved directly into the first crewed flight of the Soyuz spacecraft. Now, to their credit, they knew the vehicle wasn't safe. Soyuz engineers are said to have reported 203 design faults to party leaders, but their concerns were overruled by political pressures. Now, of course, there was an occasion that needed to be celebrated with yet another great Soviet triumph in outer space. This one was the birthday of Vladimir Lenin, the first leader of the Soviet Union. An experienced cosmonaut named Vladimir Komarov was selected as the sole pilot for the first official Soyuz flight. Even he knew the vehicle wasn't safe. Everyone involved knew that Soyuz wasn't properly tested yet. It's said that Yuri Gagarin himself tried to step in and take Komarov's place, knowing that the leadership would never risk the life of a great Soviet hero. It didn't work, and Komarov's fate was sealed. Soyuz 1 was launched on the 23rd of April 1967. The plan was for a second Soyuz to launch the following day with 3 cosmonauts on board. Then 2 of them would spacewalk over to join Soyuz 1. It would have been a fantastic demonstration of Soviet capability. But problems for Komarov began shortly after launch when one solar panel failed to unfold, leading to a shortage of power for the spacecraft systems. Then problems with the orientation system caused a gradual loss of control. By orbit number 13, the automatic stabilization system was completely dead and the manual system was only partially effective. At this point, the flight director called for an abort of the mission. After 18 orbits, Soyuz 1 fired its retro rockets and re-entered the Earth's atmosphere. Now, despite the technical difficulties up to that point, Komarov might still have landed safely. The deorbit burn was successful. It was, unfortunately, the parachute that killed him. It just didn't unfold. To this day, no one knows definitively why that happened, but it left the Soyuz plummeting from space directly towards the surface of the Earth with no hope of slowing down. It's said that Komarov died screaming, not in fear, but in anger. His last words were a curse on all of the politicians and engineers who had knowingly sealed his fate. Luck had truly run out, which is inevitable when you take such a reckless path to success. And once that momentum was lost, it would never truly come back. 2 years later, it was the N-1 rocket that would cement the defeat of the Soviet Union in the space race. Koryolev's monster was finally brought to life 3 years after his death, and it was ready to fly in February 1969. It flew for about a minute before accumulating so many failures that the booster had to be remotely shut down. It crashed into the ground 50 kilometers away. But the Soviets again were undeterred. They were back on the launch pad with another N-1 on July 3, 1969. This time the rocket flew for just a couple of seconds before the engines cut out and the whole thing fell straight back down, still loaded to the brim with rocket fuel, and blew up. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in human history. 2 short weeks after the explosion on July 16th, NASA launched Apollo 11, and on July 20th, 1969, Americans set foot on the moon for the first time. Throughout this whole period of Soviet frenzy to move forward as quickly as possible, regardless of the cost to human life, NASA had been slowly progressing forward, one small step at a time, building on meticulously planned and tested accomplishments to go bigger and bigger until they'd achieved the greatest leap in human history. Yes, there was still tragedy along the way, but there is a difference between a genuine accident and a gamble. There is measured risk, and then there's knowing that something will probably go wrong, but doing it anyway. The story of the tortoise and the hare dates back all the way to the 16th century, and there's probably a good reason that it still resonates with us to this very day.